The Bridge, a Godzilla-MLP Crossover by Tarbtano, Chapter 4, Lost and Found. Meanwhile, at Vacation Camp Evergreen, Gentleleaf beamed a smile as she ran out onto the forest trail, her green summer camp vest practically glowing in the glints of the soon fading sunlight that shone through the overcast. The camp was small and homey, close enough to a small city that gave an easing sense of home nearby for some who strive off from the feeling of isolation, while still being far enough away to get away from the urban life. It was perfect for camping. Close enough to feel safe and distant enough to be free. The forest, lake, swamps, and distant mountains, however, were more than enough for any foal to feel as if they stumbled into a jungle daring do would have passed through. Normally shy, Leaf had just gotten used to the freedom of exploration, and like the pith helmet-clad heroine of the movies from last night, she had every intention of living the wilderness up to the fullest. The counselor, frantically running through his list of charges, was less enthusiastic.
Gentleleaf.
Arrow turned around a corner as he bolted around the cabins and tents, getting to a halt to avoid crashing into the clinic so quickly his glasses whipped off his head and onto Nurse Redheart's face. The stallion was sent skittering backwards and trying to force back blushing.
Sorry, nurse,
he said, stuttering. Redheart chuckled lightly, shaking her head before picking up the fallen glasses and handing them to the counselor.
Calm down, Arrow. I promise I don't bite. You seem to be in a hurry. Where's the fire?
The memory of why he came was skittering out at best. His voice was getting hot and his tongue beginning to knot over itself.
Kid. Yes, kid. Is Gentleleaf here, or did she maybe check in today?
Nurse Redheart calmly shifted through her saddlebag and pulling out her clipboard, reading the names of any who had arrived in her clinic, flipping to the current day's page, eyes scanning the text.
Gentleleaf. No, I only saw her admitted a few days back for a scraped knee, but I haven't heard her since. Though I did see her about a half hour ago.
Where? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to raise my voice there. Where did she go? Was she with anyone?
Arrow uttered, lowering his ears and backing up a bit. Nurse Redheart outstretched her arm, pointing out like an arrow to the eastern swamp and forest trail on the closest border of the camp.
Over there. I saw her walking off into the trail. She was alone, but I assumed she was meeting you and your group there. Anywho, do I need to report a missing Kim?
Redheart cut herself short as she looked down where Arrow had been, seeing only a dust trail and a yellow blur of a frantic arrow bolting down the east trail. On the east trail, about 2 kilometers away from camp. Gentleleaf bounced along the downhill path, mutely counting down the rows of dew-covered grass flowers. So attentive she was, the filly didn't notice the tall shadow eclipsing the last flower until she crashed into a muscular hind leg. A gleaming flower was crushed under a hoof as a tall earth stallion slowly turned and loomed over the downed filly. Gentleleaf sat on her rump as she looked up at her overseer, half confused and half afraid. The stallion was a dull brownish gray with multiple ivory-colored spots on his face and back. He was an earth pony, his spiky mane and tail laying across the hornless brow and wingless back. Abnormally, though, were the ivory-colored spines similar to porcupine quills jutting out from his tail. With the turn, flicker, and sway of his tail, some of the quills had smacked against one another, a clacking sound reverberating out that continued when he fanned his tail. Clad on his forearms were some of the oddest articles Gentleleaf had ever seen. They reminded her dimly of greaves some of the royal guards wore, but instead of shiny metal bracers, his gauntlets seemed to be made of toughened dull leather and bone, with sharp spikes jutting out in a manner that made his forelimbs resemble maces more than they did any legs. Slowly, with his sharpened fangs poking out from his maw, gleaming in the lights above, he looked down at the filly.
Die are you supposed to be?
The massive stallion grunted, lowering his head down to eye level with the half-shocked filly. Gentleleaf's eyes were as wide as dinner plates, falling onto her back before trying to claw her way backwards with her arms. Her frightened and surprised expression was universal. The stallion rolled his eyes.
Hey, listen, Nestling, I ain't not gonna skin you alive. Calm down or you'll give yourself a heart attack. Listen, can you tell me where I am?
He was cutting off and on, given how much she was thrashing. Gentleleaf didn't change at all, her expression or action, still trying to crawl away with her mouth open in a silent scream. The stallion was more annoyed than anything, rolling his eyes before taking in a deep breath.
Oh, for the love of... Stop crawling away and speak up, whelp!
Gentleleaf froze as she felt the wind blow past her, starting to hyperventilate. The adult grumbled to himself and lowered his voice.
Oy, yeesh, even looking this ridiculous, people still run away. Anyways, I have no idea how I got looking like this, nor where the hell I am. You seem to understand me, so you're the only way I'm getting this information. So do you know what I am?
Gentleleaf was still wide-eyed, nodding her head. The stallion shrugged.
That's better. Can you tell me where I am?
Gentleleaf's eyes relaxed a fractional amount, nodding slowly, noting it was a bit odd she wasn't too talkative, but thinking it out of fear. He lighted up his tone to ease her.
Alright, spit her out then.
Gentleleaf sagged down a bit, her shocked facade shifting to slight sadness. The brown stallion tilted his head, curious as to the silence. He knew this song and dance well, scare the daylights out of someone by default and get the info you need. This works well usually.
Come on then, whelp, speak up if you want to be heard.
Gentleleaf looked up at him, frowning dimly. She tapped her throat before making several gestures the abnormal pony didn't recognize. She opened her mouth silently, mouthing some syllables, and by the time she shut it, the message was clear.
Oh, mute, eh?
Gentleleaf nodded sadly, getting to her feet.
Well, can you point me in the direction so I can find out where I'm at? Hey, where did a tot like you come from anyways?
Gentleleaf quickly nodded, glancing about as childish innocence eased her fear second by second. She began to spin around as she tried to look for a recognizable path, and kept looking and looking and looking, obviously confused as she spun around in a circle. The stallion rolled his eyes, grumbling.
You're lost, aren't you?
Gentleleaf stopped spinning as realization began to hit her. These woods were vast, and she ran so eagerly she easily could be far from camp. And she'd never see her friends and family, never see her home again. The tiny heart-rending squeak of mute crying exhaled, echoing into the stallion's ears. Pity overwhelming stubbornness, he shrugged slowly as he bent down and gently gripped the tearing-up filly in his maw, who seemed too saddened to notice until he lifted her up. Carefully not to prick her with his fangs, he placed her gently on his back, nuzzling her head gently as a father bird would his nestling. The monstrous stallion hummed softly as Gentleleaf's tears subsided with that. He turned his head forward again and started down the forested game trail.
Yeesh, whoever you had watching you needs a whooping. If my days on Solgull taught me anything, it's never leave someone's kid unattended. Doesn't end well. Come on, if we keep walking, you're bound to recognize something eventually.
Gentleleaf sniffed once, clearing her nose before nodding slowly, sitting up on the massive pony's back. Thankfully his hair, as quill-like as it looked, wasn't sharp.
Name's Anguirus, by the way.
Back at Sweet Apple Acres, Applejack and Fluttershy raced down the beaten path, kicking up a small dust cloud behind them. Zanilla was hot on their heels, but his unaccustomed to quadrupedal form and larger size meant he lagged behind just enough to be caught up in the kicked up dirt and dust. Well, thankfully he retained his trait of not having to breathe, an adaptation for deep space. Not even one of his energy barriers would have saved him from getting coated in road grit. By the time all three came skidding to a halt in front of the barn, the massive unicorn's blue and crystal-colored hide was dulled brown and black. At the urgency of the situation, no party seemed to notice.
Philly's found her out of town. Got into a fight with some timber wolves. Out cold by Tom Big Mac and I got there. She's in here.
Applejack uttered before pulling the slide lock aside and opening the barn door. Inside the barn, it was impossible not to notice the changes the day brought upon. Blankets and buckets of fresh water were strewn about. Granny Smith was wringing out a wet cloth, ridding the excess water before returning to the center of the room, and to the most obvious change to the barn. Strewn out on a tied hay bale made into a makeshift bed was the largest pony any in attendance had ever seen. Her crimson face cringed up a bit as the Apple family matriarch gently laid a cool towel on her forehead. Spotting the mare's wounds at an instant, Fluttershy raced forward, digging into her saddlebag full of medical supplies. Zanilla looked on as Applejack tracked his gaze upon the ill mare knowingly.
Zanella, you know her, don't you?
Zanilla craned his head back and looked out to the forest, trying to spy any obvious crash site his fallen ally had impacted.
That I do. She's from my home realm.
Applejack raised an eyebrow.
Home route? Oh, forget it. Who is she?
Zanilla looked back into the barn, slowly walking towards the center, with Applejack following alongside.
She had no parents to christen her, though some people refer to her as Destroyer, so she just adopted the label.
Destroy ya?
Applejack's eyes narrowed in the same manner she would look upon someone like Chrysalis or Nightmare Moon. There were many nice names in the world. That was not one of them. She hadn't even met the mare Conscious, but her looks and name were already putting the Earth Pony on edge, an edge Zanilla could detect.
She's uneasy. Smart mare. Knowing Destroyer when she wakes herself up, it's not going to be a good day for these ponies. Considering what Fluttershy has told me about this world and its powers and our diminished state, that won't end well for either of us. If even some suspicion is raised due to that witch's actions, we both could get done in. Destroyer, you always were a kill first, ask questions later type. Perhaps it's time I put the tack dog on a leash. I know, not the friendliest name, but she is an old ally of mine. Don't worry though, she has a lot more bark than a bite. So long as no one annoys her, she'll be fine. Don't expect her to show up to any parties though. I thank you for rescuing her. Who's found her again?
Zanilla's words hardly put any more ease into Applejack's mind, but before she could answer, 3 small forms bolted in from the barn doors, darting across the barn floor. 2 forms weaved their way between Zanilla's legs and shot towards Fluttershy. The third arched around and came grinding to a halt in front of the massive stallion. Looking down, Zanilla didn't know whether to look amused or annoyed at the glaring-eyed white filly blocking his path.
Who are you? You're huge! How'd you get here? Your horn is awesome! You have fangs! Are you evil?
Applejack decided to cut Sweetie Belle's question barrage short.
Sweetie, one at a time, please. This feller's a pal of your friend there. He just came to see how she's holding.
Zanilla lowered his head down into the now grinning filly, obvious annoyance starting to show through, that he quickly bit back. Good first impressions of it were.
Greetings. I presume you're one of the fillies who found her?
Sweetie Belle nodded rapidly.
Over by the stream. Then she saved us from some timberwolves.
Zanilla's eyebrow cocked up before realization hit his mind. He walked harmlessly over the filly and towards the downed Destroyer, his horn beginning to glow.
Saved you? Little one, you have no idea.
Back at the forest. Arrow was not having a good day. Not having a good day at all. To say he was anxious was the understatement of the decade. One of the fillies he was specifically put in charge of had disappeared down a trail she had never been before and had a good head start on him. The unicorn was frantically darting about, looking behind every shrub, stone, and tree in hopes of catching a glimpse at Gentleleaf's little form, hopefully in good condition. So concentrated on his hunt, the stallion didn't notice the streak of cyan that darted overhead, and barely heard the frantic cry before a streak of blue and rainbow nearly slammed into him. A scrambling form slammed into Arrow, dead in the center of his mass, knocking the wind out of his lungs and turning his world black. Several moments passed before his vision began to return in a blurry mess of light blue, the piercing ringing in his ears deafening the world as his vision spun. He could hear a mare's voice, but the ringing in his ears distorted the voice so much he'd have better luck trying to discern her words underwater.
Oh my gosh, you okay? I'm sorry.
The lack of slight weight on his muzzle at least told him why his vision seemed so blurred. Instinctively, his horn ignited and readjusted his fumbled glasses, putting them onto their proper place, and his mind and senses returned.
And I couldn't pull up in time, and the downdraft kind of shoved me into you.
The cyan blue mare cracked a nervous grin as she rubbed the back of her head. Her multicolored mane was recognizable nationwide, and Arrow newly adjusted his eyes as they widened.
Anywho, name's Rainbow Dash.
The mare, who was hovering just above him with steady wing beats, extended her forelimb to offer him a hoof up. The half-dumbstruck Arrow obliged. The Pegasus helped the unicorn to his feet and continued on.
Still sorry about that. I swear that draft came out of nowhere. I didn't think I'd land on another pony all the way out here. What are you doing all the way out here anyways?
Arrow stood himself up to his full form and dusted off his vest, shaking out his mane and tail from any more loose particles. All it took was one look at a mare with less than perfect definition of personal space for his stutter to kick up.
I'm Arrow. I'm a vacation camp counselor. I was out looking for... Oh, Foss, Gentleleaf!
Arrow's hair nearly stuck up on end at the remembrance of why he was out here, frantically jumping up and darting at every shrub or tree nearby and calling out the filly's name. Rainbow Dash rolled her eyes before flying over to the screaming unicorn, grabbing him by the shoulder and gently but firmly smacking him across the face to snap the poor stallion out of his panic. Arrow stopped instantly, rubbing his cheek lightly, thankful she avoided hitting his glasses.
Thanks. Sorry.
Rainbow Dash sighed and set herself on the ground in front of Arrow.
No need for you to lose your head in the middle of the woods. Now, who or what is this Gentleleaf that's got you flipping out?
Arrow's eyes lowered in a dual sensation of shame, concern, and a very adult fear.
She's just a young filly, very past full age, and one of the campers I was in charge of. She's an eager explorer and ran off on this trail when I wasn't with her. She's lost somewhere out here. If I don't find her, she might be...
Arrow closed his eyes before he felt a hoof on his shoulder.
Hey, I'm sure she's fine. Tell you what, I'll throw my hoof into this little search party. Between the two of us, she'll be safe, sound, and back at the camp within the hour.
An honest smile under her magenta eyes was enough to give him a sense of some ease. Arrow exhaled slowly to ease his heart rate as he walked past her down the trail.
We got a lot of ground to cover. Not exactly a game of hide-and-go-seek.
Rainbow rolled her eyes with a chuckle, giving Arrow a friendly punch in the shoulder.
Put a cork in it. I've seen runaway carriages before. One misplaced filly is no problem.
Anguirus had been walking for some time, and his charge hadn't given the former kaiju any indication she had recognized anything for a while. The added weight of her head on his back and the near silent sound of light snoozing confirmed one reason why that was so. Glancing back at the curled up form of the filly, the fanged stallion sighed and continued walking, now relying solely on his senses to try and find where the filly had come from. Crossing a shallow stream, Anguirus gave a frightened look at his new reflection.
This place is weird. Just weird. Many things, the trees, the creatures, the feelings all seem vaguely familiar, but different. The sights and sounds all seem reminiscent of back home, but distinct. Everything is close enough to be recognizable, but something just made them all seem so odd that they seem alien. Even the air smells funny here. Liz walking still the same. Yep, you're definitely not in Soldo anymore.
Wading out of the stream, Anguirus closed his eyes and put his snoot into the breeze to try and detect any familiar scents, fanning his ears to pick up any sounds. After a short time, the stallion convert shrugged in failure.
Gentleleaf?
Gentleleaf!
Anguirus' eyes shifted slightly as he homed in on the direction of the voices, the differing pitches and growing volume showing that there was at least two, and they were growing closer. Walking up the trail that should be in their path, Anguirus drew up a plan and put it into motion. If this world mimicked his well enough, only a few races would be sentient enough to talk and understand speech. So far, the only one he'd seen in this world was his own, the same race this village belonged to. Chances were those voices were equine as well, possibly searching for something. They get the child, he follow them back to a settlement and get his bearings, maybe try to find any others who got flung into this messed up world along with him. The former dinosaur kaiju smirked at the thought of some monster like Destroya being stuck in this form. Craning his neck around and gently grabbing the sleeping filly by the back, Anguirus picked Gentleleaf up and set her down in the middle of the path, the searching party's voices growing louder and louder. Noting their greatly increasing volume and fleeting glimpse of cyan blue through the trees ahead, Anguirus turned and hid in a thicket of shrubs and a fallen tree trunk just off the trail. Peering out in the small hole of his camouflage, intuition paid off.
Over there!
Gentleleaf!
It took several minutes, and Arrow fretting over if the groggy, shaken awake filly had so much as a paper cut on her before the trio set back for the camp. Gentleleaf waking up enough to walk alongside. Questions dawned in the two young adults' head. They had found the filly just past a deep brook, yet she was perfectly dry. They had found large prints, but she seemed totally alone. The mute filly herself seemed occupied with something on her head. Near every step the group took, Gentleleaf was off looking in several directions, as if she was looking for someone. Finally, after 2 minutes of walking, the first indication they weren't alone became obvious. A deep shake echoed from the shrubs, masking a large form wadding through the foliage. Gentleleaf shot up in a mute glee and darted at the form, sure she knew exactly who it was. Rainbow Dash reacted first as Gentleleaf disappeared into the greenery, internally begging that something would happen to cultivate the utter bore this trip had been so far. Flapping her wings in a boosted jump, the mare sprang over the foliage and landed in a small clearing.
Alright, Shortstack, what you got your attention up on?
Gentleleaf's mouth and eyes were agape in fear, frozen in place atop wobbling legs as a bipedal form twice the size of most stallions loomed over her. Grinning behind batteries of razor-edged teeth meant for cutting through gemstone, yellow eyes glared over to the rainbow mare as half a dozen young drakes with a plethora of shapes emerged out from the tree line. A small growl made their intent clear.
Well, look what the manticore dragged in.
Rainbow Dash's eyes narrowed in defiance of fear as she lowered down to the ground, Gentleleaf hiding between her legs.
Garble!